Tansei, I'm Krisanachkate. Welcome to APTN National News. Thank you for joining us. The election had many voters biting their nails as the tight race between the Liberals and Conservatives trickled on throughout the night. Our Sav Jonesa was watching those numbers and joins us now. Sav, thanks so much for being here. What were the final numbers and how did the provinces and territories vote?
It's a great question. I have lots of data for you here from Elections Canada. They say more than 99% of the polls have reported as of 10 a.m. Central this morning, and there were roughly 500 that still need to be counted across the country. The Liberals won a minority government with 168 seats. They needed 172 to form a majority government. The Conservative Party is the official opposition with 144 seats in Parliament. The NDP fell from grace, though, winning only 7 seats, 18 less than the previous federal election. They lost official party status, which requires 12 seats, and their leader, Jagmeet Singh, stepped down after losing in his riding. The Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, is also projected to have lost in his riding, a seat he has held since 2004, but said last night he will stay on as party leader. The Bloc Québécois won 23 seats, and the Green Party won 1 seat. And I'd love to give you a breakdown of how the regions voted across the country. The East Coast was dominated by the Liberal Red. The party won 71% of the electoral districts in Newfoundland and Labrador, 60% in New Brunswick, and a whopping 90% in Nova Scotia and 100% in Prince Edward Island. Continuing their streak, the Liberals won Quebec with 55% of electoral districts, and the province's Bloc Québécois came in second with 29%. Ontario saw the Liberals winning 56% of districts. And now this is where things start to change, Creason. Manitoba voted mainly Conservative. They won 50% of the districts. So did Saskatchewan with almost 93% of districts. The blue wave continues with Conservatives claiming almost 92% of districts in Alberta. British Columbia was very close, but the Liberals came out on top with 46%, only 2 points ahead of the Conservatives. The territories each have 1 seat in Parliament. Nunavut is very close, with NDP currently holding 37.3% of the vote to the Liberals' 36.6%. And Yukon and Northwest Territories went to the Liberals with 50% of the vote for each.
How many voters came out, Sav?
Preliminary numbers so far say that more than 67% of eligible voters participated in this election. That's more than 19 million Canadians who voted out of a possible 28.5 million already registered. But keep in mind, that's not including voters who registered at the polls on election day, and some polls are still reporting, so that number will go up. That's the largest voter turnout for a federal election in 32 years, Creason, wow, since 1993, where 70.9% of voters went to the polls. There is one exception to this, the 2015 election that saw Justin Trudeau first become prime minister with 3% voter turnout. Preliminary estimates say 7.3 million Canadians cast their votes in advance voting.
What was the final numbers of Indigenous candidates elected? I saw that it might have gone down a bit.
Yeah, so there were 45 Indigenous candidates across the country in 35 electoral districts running. British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec all had the most running in their provinces with 8 each. I'm using projected numbers here, but so far it looks like it's safe to say 11 Indigenous candidates won ridings and seats in Parliament this election. Last federal election saw 77 candidates running, winning 12 seats. The party breakdown of those who won is 3 for Conservatives, 5 for Liberals, 2 for NDP, and 1 Bloc Québécois. Some candidates to mention are the incumbents who are keeping their seats, like Conservative Mark Dalton for Meadows Maple Ridge, BC, NDP Leah Gazan for Winnipeg Centre, Manitoba, Liberal Jaime Baptiste for Cape Breton, Kansno, Antigonish, NDP Laurie Idlout for Nunavut, and Bloc Québécois Simon-Pierre Savard Tremblay for Yeah, Kristen, as I mentioned before, Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh both lost in their ridings. NDP incumbent for Edmonton Griesbach, Lake Desjardins, lost the seat he won in the last election by a wide margin to Conservative Carrie Diot. Desjardins is known as a fierce advocate for Indigenous peoples and also the first openly Two-Spirit person to serve as an MP. We also saw an Indigenous candidate win a seat long held by an incumbent. Liberal candidate Rebecca Chartrand, who is now Member of Parliament for Churchill-Kiiwetinoong-Aski riding, swept up the votes from NDP incumbent Nikki Ashton, who had a strong hold on the district since the 2008 election. Chartrand won by 17 percentage points. There were also reports of polling stations only staying open for about 2 or 3 hours out of a standard 12-hour operation in Nunavut, Quebec, an area with a high Inuit population. Some of its residents said online that their polling stations did not receive enough voting material.
Thank you, Sav, for that breakdown.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Creason.
Here now to talk about the election results is Cody Grote. He's an assistant professor in the Department of History and Indigenous Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. He was also an NDP federal candidate in the 2023 by-election for the riding of Oxford and is also Mohawk from the Six Nations of the Grand River. Cody, thank you so much for chatting with us. What is your initial reaction to the results of this election?
I think if we look at this result and compare it to what we might have thought we were going to have 6 months ago, it is a drastically different expectation. We thought this was going to be a massive Conservative landslide majority victory, and now we see Mark Carney most likely having a minority government. There's still a slim chance of a majority, but I think we're going to settle on a minority government. So a huge change. I think it's reflective of what we've seen in the polls since Mark Carney's taken office, which again was only a handful of weeks ago. So I think it's definitely an interesting turn of events compared to what we were expecting for years of how this next election might have turned out.
Why do you think voters picked this prime minister this time around?
I think it was definitely that threat of Donald Trump played a role. We hear this conversation of potentially annexing aspects of Canada, threats to our national sovereignty, the tariff rhetoric. And I think Mark Carney just sort of had that more convincing message at this point in time. I think we saw, this rhetoric of him being a central banker. Some of that was levied against him, some of that rhetoric. He also did a very good job nuancing his message in a way to play up the benefits of his role in those financial positions, while also kind of avoiding some of the rhetoric of the more negative messaging associated with his tenure, especially with the Bank of England. There was some messaging near the end of the campaign that tried to frame him in a specific way, and luckily he was able to work around that. And I think Pierre Poilievre spent his whole tenure as opposition leader framing a very specific message against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, against the carbon tax, and then all of a sudden that key messaging simply disappeared, and he had to try to pivot as significantly or as quickly as he could, and I don't think he was able to do that in enough time. And of course, we're going to see what the future for Pierre Poilievre is.
Yeah, your thoughts also on Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre losing his seat in the riding of Carleton to the Liberals, a seat Poilievre has held for almost 2 decades.
I think it's going to be so hard to tell what played a factor in that. The Conservatives went up almost 20 seats nationwide. Their vote share increased to one of the largest vote shares they've had in the past several elections, but we have the party leader losing his seat. I'm not sure if that's a referendum on him and his own riding. His riding was slightly redrawn. There was an increase of civil servants, typically left-leaning voters who moved into the riding of Carleton. There was also that long ballot initiative. I think there was close to 90 candidates in the riding of Carleton in a specific attempt to push for electoral reform. So Pierre Poilievre's in a really difficult position because the party increased by almost 20 seats. It increased its vote share, but he does not have a seat in the House of Commons. And that was his whole pitch against Mark Carney for the past several weeks. Mark Carney doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons. He's unelected right now, and now he finds himself in that position. I'm hearing he might try to run in a federal by-election. They're going to see if perhaps a Conservative MP will step down, and Pierre Poilievre might run in a safer seat. But again, I think his leadership definitely took a blow last night. In this election, he was supposed to win in a landslide, and now he didn't win, and he didn't even win his own seat.
The NDP lost party status, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh lost in his riding and has resigned as party leader. Your thoughts on what happened there, Cody?
I think what happened is this ended up being a two-party race. This was a referendum on Canada, some of the rhetoric that we've been seeing, and I've commented before on APTN some of the issues with that by framing Canadian nationalism as a central election issue. We see that decline in the rhetoric about Indigenous nationalism and sovereignty. But that's what it turned into. It was a referendum on, I really think it wasn't a policy election. And that's one thing that the NDP can sort of gain some traction is some of those policy issues. It really wasn't a policy election to the same extent that we've seen in a while. I think social policy is going to, in theory, take a little bit of a back burner in the next few months. It's going to focus on economic policy and perhaps foreign relations to an extent that Justin Trudeau didn't focus on to that same extent, and there was just no way for other parties to break through that mold of that two-party dialogue. So we've also seen over the years the NDP's fortunes have slowly started declining anyway, but I think the drastic drop all of a sudden is a little bit beyond his control. For the past several years, he's tried to carve out his message, but he's just not broken through, and I think that can be a performance factor. He won his last leadership review, but there was a lot of conversation that he probably shouldn't have. There was some debate about that leadership review, so I think the timing was right for him to resign.
The number of Indigenous MPs looked like it dropped a bit to just 7 Indigenous MPs compared to the previous 11 Indigenous MPs. Do you think these voices are just as important now than before?
I think what's an interesting part of that question is the number of new voices that we're seeing when it comes to Indigenous members of Parliament. So we have some returning people. Leah Gazan for the NDP, one of the very few NDP victories last night. We have Jaime Batiste for the Liberals, has been re-elected as well. But then we have what looks like about 5 new Indigenous MPs, and some of them have very deep and extensive resumes. So Mandy Gull-Masti for the Liberals, former Grand Chief of the Cree Nation, Northern Quebec, a very extensive resume. Then we also have the Conservatives elected 2 very strong voices. We had Billy Morin, former Chief of Enoch Cree Nation, and we have Ellis Ross, Haisla Nation Councillor-in-Chief. Both of them are pro-economic development, pro-resource development. And I think it'll be interesting to see if Billy Morin or Ellis Ross are offered shadow cabinet secretary positions in those files as very strong First Nations representatives.
Cody, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you for having me.
There were 5 Saskatchewan ridings the Assembly of First Nations flagged as areas where First Nation voters could determine who wins. Saskatoon West was one of them. Last night, APTN's Rachel May spoke with the Liberal candidate in Saskatoon West about his party's overall win and what it could mean for Indigenous people.
I'm Rachel May here in Saskatoon West with Liberal candidate Chad Egerman. We saw an amazing turnout for the Liberals in this election. Tell me a little bit about what it feels like to be on the winning team.
You know what, it feels great. It really feels great. So I was sitting at home watching the results come in Atlantic, Canada, and frankly I was a little concerned. I was a bit concerned, but as we move further into Quebec and Ontario, I could see that Canadians have decided to make the right choice and vote for a strong government, a strong leader. Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to lead us forward in a way that we just really haven't seen before. This is a new leader at a really challenging time for us, and I think Canadians have really recognized that.
And so when we spoke prior to the election, you mentioned working with Indigenous communities, and that work doesn't stop now. So tell me a little bit about what the future holds for you.
So listen, nothing will change for me. So what the future holds for me is I'll continue working together with my Indigenous clients, First Nations, tribal councils, Métis locals, Métis provincial organizations, and we'll keep working on Call to Action 92. Economic reconciliation doesn't just happen. You can't just talk about it. You have to do things and make it happen. I'll continue doing that as a lawyer here in Saskatoon and Saskatchewan. But here's the important part. I know that I'm going to be supported by a Prime Minister that believes in those same values. I'll be supported supported by a federal government that wants to continue to support Indigenous people in economic development. And I think also critically, we're going to have a Liberal MP in northern Saskatchewan, and that's very exciting. Buckley Boulanger is an incredible Indigenous leader, an incredible politician, an incredible human being, and we'll have to see how he is positioned within the federal government. But I expect that he'll be taking on a very prominent role, and I'm really excited to work together with Buckley. Northern Saskatchewan is really a driver for a lot of economic development in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and especially in Saskatoon West. And so I'm pretty optimistic. Again, I'm not going to Ottawa, but for me, I really see a bright future ahead for everything that's happening in the north.
Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
Thank you, Rachel. Now, Saskatchewan, like most of Western Canada, has voted Conservative for decades. But the Liberals took one Saskatchewan seat last night in a sea of Tory blue. We'll have more on that story later on APTN National News. We have more news coming up after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Whitehorse Dam is an integral piece of infrastructure for the Yukon and is now undergoing relicensing, which will determine its future operation. Part of that process entails a decision document from the territorial and federal governments, which was released earlier this month. But as APTN's Sarah Connors tells us, one First Nation says that decision document doesn't go far enough to protect their interests, nor that of the Chinook salmon.
Built in 1958, the Whitehorse Dam is considered a critical piece of infrastructure. It generates around 75% of electricity for Yukoners in the summer. But First Nations like the Carcross-Tagish have long claimed the dam is a barrier for migrating fish, especially Chinook salmon, which have been in decline for decades.
The impacts that the facility has had on our lands and waters, animals, fish, and then all of that holistically combined to affect our citizens' way of life is just huge for us.
The dam is operated by Yukon Energy. Its current license expires at the end of May. The Crown Corporation has been in the process of renewing its license for the last 3 years. The Yukon Socio-Economic Assessment Board, or YESAB, says the dam should be relicensed with conditions to protect fish and treaty rights. Earlier this month, the territorial and federal governments, which are decision bodies for the relicensing, accepted the board's recommendations with additional or new modifications. That includes developing a plan to reduce the number of fish sucked into the dam's turbines. But Carcross-Tagish says they didn't sign agreements with Yukon Energy or other parties, and they're concerned their voice is not being equally heard in finding solutions for safer fish passage.
It's not terrible, but we do feel that the ESIB evaluation and then subsequently the decision document are lacking serious mitigations for the facility, especially in terms of Chinook salmon, both upstream and downstream.
Well, we're really pleased to see the decision documents come out.
The corporation says it understands Carcross-Tagish's concerns and is working diligently to reduce impacts on salmon, including implementing changes based on their feedback.
I think the decision document does a great job of identifying some of the things that we're already working on.
Carcross-Tagish says it realizes the dam is important, but it wants an equal seat at the table as the licensing process continues. At the end of the day, it wants the salmon to be protected.
Yeah, for the future, we really would like to see those salmon numbers back up.
Yukon Energy applied for a 20-year license with the Yukon Water Board last fall, but as that license is unlikely to be in place by May 31st, it recently applied for a 60-day license. If approved, the dam will continue operations from June 1st to July 30th. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
Thank you, Sarah. We now want to tell you about this week's new web poll question. Over on our website, we ask, are you happy with the results of the federal election? Your answers are yes, no, or I don't care. Go to our website at aptnnews.ca/polls to cast your ballot. A man from the Ocean Man First Nation in southern Saskatchewan has recently released new music. That story when we come back. Welcome back. We're going to hold off on that Ocean Man story and instead give you this story. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew says a Winnipeg forest will become a provincial park. Kinew says the wheels are in motion to expropriate the land, and recently land defenders who had been maintaining a sacred fire at a spot near the Lemay Forest held a celebratory feast. APTN's Christopher Reed was there.
After months of speaking up and standing her ground against a proposal to cut down the woods and develop the land for housing, Diane Bousquet is finally able to take a moment to feel what's happened.
It's weird because everything still feels kind of surreal. I'm still waiting for that gotcha moment, but I'm excited, I'm happy, I'm emotional, I'm sad. I'm seeing a real step towards reconciliation, but also a close of a chapter that was fairly significant in my life. So it's bittersweet, right?
Last week, Premier Wab Kinew announced the province would step in and expropriate the land located in the St. Norbert neighborhood on the southern edge of Winnipeg.
Welcome to Lemay Forest, and soon to be Manitoba's newest provincial park.
The land the forest is on includes a cemetery, which holds the remains of children, many of whom were Indigenous, from an adjacent orphanage.
When you walk into it, you know exactly where you are. There's no pretending. So it would be nice to see it honored and memorialized as much as the rest of the sites that may be out there.
The children buried here have a lot to do with why people came out to try to stop a proposed 5,000-bed, 2,500-unit assisted living facility.
So yeah, today we're gathering to honor and celebrate that the children of the forest will be provincially protected now.
Lindsay Brown is a Métis woman who lives nearby.
In December, when I heard that there was chainsaws desecrating the land, my entire body and spirit just felt called to be here, to grieve with the land, to grieve with the children and the unwed mothers that hadn't been acknowledged.
Another neighbor, Kat Gauthier, has been involved in the months-long protest too.
So yeah, a group of neighbors met on a front lawn when the first development proposal was sort of revealed, and we're beside ourselves because all of those trees, nature, everything, and we know the benefits of urban forests. And then again in December, and then on December 27th, a group of Indigenous people I'd never met before lit a sacred fire, and the community came together to support them, to sit by the fire, to learn, to grow with them, and it's been an amazing experience.
The Premier didn't make it out to the closing fire ceremony and feast, but he was a popular fellow at the feast nonetheless. If the Premier was here, Wab Kinew, would you want to say anything to him?
I'd say, come on, have some food and let's party. Let's have a feast, I'd say.
Christopher Reed, APTN National News.
It has not been announced yet on what the province will pay Tocho Development Group, the current landowner, for the 18 acres of land. And that's your daytime newscast for this Tuesday, April 29th. Dennis Ward is back for your evening newscast with election reaction with National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepanak. Please join us then. From all of us at APTN National News, hi miigwech masicho. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again. Ekse.